Before the fever took his sight, old Vin was already a legend among carvers. He didn't work in the grand halls of cities or sell his art to tourists. Instead, he carved alone in a small shop by the perfumed river, where incense floated in through the bamboo blinds, and time seemed to pass a little slower. His hands were famous in the region, not because they were fast, but because they never rushed. It was said that he once spent 5 weeks shaping the eyelids of a single Buddha statue, because he believed the soul would only enter once the eyes could rest. When he became blind in the spring of 1979 after a violent fever that came and went in a single week, many assumed he would never carve again. After all, what is a sculptor without his sight? But Vin refused to surrender. He locked his workshop doors for nearly a year, and when he opened them again, he didn't explain. He simply sat at his old bench, ran his fingers across the grain of a fresh jackfruit wood block, and began to carve, not as he once did, but slower with both hands, gliding across the surface like someone reading a forgotten letter. He began to listen to the wood, not metaphorically, literally. He claimed the fibers of each block sang in different ways. Some vibrated like drums, some whispered like water through reeds. He even stopped using design sketches. When asked what he was making, he'd say, "I don't know yet. The wood hasn't told me." At first, people thought it was madness. Then they saw the work. Blind, he carved with more truth than ever before. A woman holding her breath. A tree bent toward a song. A child reaching into the dark. None of it was perfect, but every piece made people weep. Then came the block that refused to speak. It arrived on a Monday morning, brought by a quiet traveler whose face Vin never saw. The man left it by the doorstep with a short message. "It's from the north, found it in a collapsed house. I think it belongs here." The wood was heavy, not large, but dense in a strange way, like it carried something unfinished. Vin welcomed the challenge. He ran his hands along its edges, tapped it gently with his knuckles, even pressed his ear against it, waiting for a vibration. Nothing. Just silence. He tried carving anyway. The first cut chipped his blade, the second cracked the surface. On the third attempt, his chisel slipped and sliced his thumb. For the first time in years, he pushed the block away. This one, he whispered to himself, voice trembling not from fear, but from confusion does not want to be known. Stayed untouched for days, sitting in the corner of his workshop like a wound that refused to close. Even the birds that usually perched near his window seemed quieter. Vin, now in his 60s, began to question the very thing that had kept him alive all these years, his belief that every wood had a story. But everything changed on the seventh night. In his sleep, a memory returned, not a vision for his eyes, no longer offered those, but a sound, a lullaby, not in words, but in rhythm. It was the melody his mother used to hum when he was small, weaving mats by lamplight when the world outside still held fire and gunshots. He hadn't heard it in over 50 years. Yet now in the dark of his blindness, the song returned. When he woke, he did not reach for his tools. He walked barefoot to the block, sat cross-legged and rested both palms flat on its surface. Then, with a voice barely above breath, he hummed the tune not beautifully, not even in tune, but with the exact cadence of childhood. The wood for the first time was warm. Beneath his hands, he felt it breathe. And finally, after all that silence, it spoke. Vin began to carve the next morning, not with certainty, but with instinct. He did not ask the block what it wanted to be. He asked it what it remembered. The lullaby still lingered in the back of his throat, humming softly as his hands moved with a gentleness rarely seen in men his age. He started not with a face or a figure, but with rhythm lines carved not for shape but for tempo. Each cut was like a breath, a pause, a note. Days passed in this way. Visitors came, watched from a distance, and left quietly sensing something sacred unfolding behind that wooden door. He didn't speak much, just worked and hummed. What emerged was not a statue in any traditional sense. There was no Buddha, no saint, no phoenix rising. It was a form seated low to the ground, torso bent forward, arms gently wrapping an invisible child. The figure's head had no face, just smooth wood tilted as if listening. The chest was hollow intentionally, so carved open like the mouth of a drum, but it was not empty. Inside, Vin had shaped a single strand of spiraling wood twisted gently like smoke frozen in air. No one knew what to call it. Vin never named it. He simply said, "This is what the song became." On the fifth day, as rain began to fall over the tiled roofs of the village, a woman knocked on the frame of the open workshop door. She did not speak right away. She just stood there listening. Vin, without turning, nodded once. "Come in," he said. "I heard it," she whispered. "From the road. I don't know why, but I followed it." Vin turned toward her voice, slow and careful. "The song?" he asked. She nodded, though he could not see it. "My mother used to hum it. I haven't heard it since I was a child." Something in the air stilled. Vin laid down his chisel. "Sit," he said gently. She walked over slowly, as if afraid to disturb the quiet that had been carved into the room. "You knew it too?" she asked. "Not the words," he said, "only the breath." The woman ran her fingers along the edge of the statue's open chest. "I think this is what I came for," she said. "Not to see it, to remember something I forgot I needed." She told him her name was Mai. Her mother had been from a village farther north, a weaver like Vin's own. During the war, they had fled to different provinces, lost track of one another, never met again. Mai had spent years trying to reclaim pieces of her family history. Letters, worn photographs, fragments of stories. But nothing had ever felt alive. Until now. "I thought I was going mad," she admitted. "When I heard the song in my sleep last week, I thought it was just grief. But now I'm here." Vin sat with her in silence. Then he whispered something she would never forget. "Some songs," he said, "are meant to be remembered by more than one voice. If you believe that wood can carry not just the weight of memory, but the echo of bloodlines and longing, then you already understand why this story is not about carving. It's about returning. It's about two strangers humming the same forgotten lullaby in different parts of the world and finding each other through grain silence and song." The rain didn't stop for 2 more days. It wasn't harsh, just steady, like the sky itself had joined the rhythm of the carving. Inside the workshop, Vin and Mai sat opposite each other, the statue between them, its chest still open, unfinished. Mai hadn't intended to stay. She had no tools, no training. But somehow Vin made space for her, not just at the bench, but in the story. He handed her a small block of soft wood and a simple carving knife worn from decades of use. "Start small," he said. "Shape what you remember, even if you don't know what it is yet." At first she hesitated. Her hands were made for writing, not shaping. But as the blade met the wood, something inside her shifted. She wasn't making art. She was unearthing something buried beneath years of silence. A curve, a line, a hollow fold like fabric. She didn't know what it would become, only that it had been waiting. Vin didn't guide her. He just listened. Sometimes he hummed, and she found herself carving to the rhythm of his breath. Other times they sat without sound, letting the wood speak first. She worked beside him for hours, then days. By the end of the week, the statue's hollow chest had begun to change. Inside, where once there was only the spiral, they added small pieces, her folds of fabric, his notches of sound. Together they created a kind of cradle, not for a child, but for memory itself. When they stepped back, it didn't feel like a sculpture. It felt like a room that had always been there. The villagers came as they often did, but now they didn't speak when they entered. They simply stood, hands clasped, eyes soft. One old woman left a photograph inside the open chest. A man placed a folded letter. A child laid down a smooth rock and whispered a name. The statue wasn't finished. It never would be. That was the point. Vin said it best late one night as Mike cleaned their brushes. "Some carvings aren't meant to end," he said. "They're meant to keep listening." Mai stayed through the season. She returned to her life, eventually her home, her job, but never completely. Part of her remained in that workshop, in the grain of the chest they carved together. And every year on the same week, the rain first brought her to the village, she returned. If this story reminds you that not all creations come from talent, but from truth, then you already understand the soul of carving. It's not about mastery. It's about invitation, about making space for someone else's hands to continue where yours pause. And if you're still reading, maybe this story was meant to reach you too. It was early spring when he arrived. A tall man in a charcoal suit, polished shoes, and the kind of voice that always sounded like it was explaining something important. He introduced himself as Mr. Koa, a curator from the National Museum of Traditional Arts in Saigon. He had read about Vin's work in a faded issue of an old cultural journal and had driven 8 hours to see the statue with his own eyes. I was told, he said, that there's a piece here, unlike any other, one that doesn't have a name, and maybe never should. Vin greeted him politely, though his ears were already tuning into something else, the faint tension beneath the man's practiced tone. Koa stepped into the workshop, slowly took off his glasses, and stood in front of the statue. He didn't speak, not for 5 whole minutes. When he did, his voice was softer. "It's not beautiful," he said, "at least not in the traditional sense. It's honest." He made his offer that same afternoon, a generous one. Enough money to repair the workshop twice over. Enough to fund apprenticeships for young artists in the village. Enough to give Vin in his final years comfort he had long done without. He spoke of preservation of glass cases and proper lighting. "It will be seen by thousands," he said. "Children will grow up asking about the blind carver from here. It deserves to be remembered." Vin said nothing. Mai, who had returned just that morning for a yearly visit, stood in the doorway listening. That night over tea, she asked Vin what he would do. He smiled gently, as he always did when words tried too hard. "They see a sculpture," he said. "We know it's a room." She nodded. "But rooms can be moved. Can't they?" Vin thought for a long time. "Only if the people inside go with it." The next day the village gathered. Not because Vin had summoned them, but because word travels differently in places where silence is shared like bread. One by one they stood before the statue, not to admire it, but to speak into it. Stories, prayers, names of people long buried. When Mr. Koa returned to collect the piece, he found more than wood. He found candles, letters, a doll, a torn page from a songbook, a string bracelet tied gently to the figure's open hand. He stepped back, unsure. "This doesn't belong in a museum," he said quietly. Vin smiled for the first time in days. "No," he replied. "It belongs to those who need it. If you believe that art is not just something we look at, but something we return to when we're lost, then you understand why this statue will never leave its home. Not because it cannot move, but because it has already become a part of the air, the soil, and the breath of everyone who stands beside it." That evening, after the curator had driven away, the rain returned, not heavy, just steady, as if to seal something sacred back into the earth. The villagers didn't speak of the offer. They didn't need to. No one asked why it had been refused. They only came, one by one, in silence, in pairs, in memories. They stood before the open-chested statue, and instead of leaving something behind this time, they began to speak. It started with an old woman who ran the tea stall near the banyan tree. She stepped forward with a voice that cracked like dry wood. "The handkerchief I placed inside belonged to my husband," she said. "He died during the flood of '95. I never got to say goodbye. But here when I come, I feel like he listens." Then the village's retired school teacher stepped up. "That letter folded and worn, that was my daughter's handwriting. We argued before she left for America. I kept that note in my pocket for 7 years. But I only forgave myself when I placed it in the chest of this statue." A young boy, maybe 10, whispered from behind his mother. "I left my rock because it's from the mountain where my dad slipped. I think maybe the statue knows the mountain too." Even the quiet fisherman who never spoke unless asked came forward. "The string bracelet, it was my sister's. She sang that same lullaby when we were children. I didn't know anyone else remembered it until I heard it humming from this room." Mai stood near the doorway, hand against the wood, eyes misted not with grief, but with understanding. These weren't offerings. They were echoes, pieces of people still reaching for something that words had failed to hold. The statue wasn't collecting memory. It was keeping memory company. It was a companion to sorrow, not a container of it. That night, Vin didn't carve. He just listened to the way each voice cracked open, to the stories that had waited years for air, and to the silence that followed deep, full, and somehow warm. Later, long after the others had gone home, Mai asked him if he had ever expected this, that his final unfinished work would become a kind of temple. He smiled slow and quiet. I only carved the space, he said. They brought the soul. You believe that sometimes the most powerful art is not made by one hand, but by many hearts whispering in the dark. Then you understand what this statue has become. Not a monument, not a masterpiece, but a listening place. A hush in the storm, a memory with open arms. Vin never spoke of dying, not directly. But as spring folded into summer and the cicadas began their slow and steady hymn, people noticed he moved slower. His hands, once firm as chisels themselves, now trembled slightly before each stroke. He carved less, not because he was weak, but because he had already said most of what needed saying. Still something lingered in his posture, a quiet intention, a carving not yet begun. Mai noticed it first. One evening after sweeping the floor and refilling the incense bowl, she caught him sitting in the darkest corner of the workshop holding a small block of wood no larger than his palm. It was blackened at the edges, aged almost brittle. She had never seen him touch it before. "What is that?" she asked. Vin didn't look up. The last piece, he whispered. Not to be shown, not to be explained. He carved it only at night. Not in his usual spot, but on the back porch under the tamarind tree, where the shadows curled around him like old friends. He didn't use his larger tools, just a thin blade and his fingernails, working in layers so delicate they seemed woven more than carved. Mai watched from a distance. Sometimes he hummed, sometimes he cried. Once she saw him press the block against his chest and hold it there for a very long time, as if waiting for something to pass between them. No one else knew. He hid the piece beneath his pillow during the day. And then one morning, the bench was empty. The tools were cleaned. The block was gone. And Vin did not rise. He passed in his sleep the same way he had worked quietly without fanfare and holding something unfinished close to his heart. The village didn't ring bells or hold long ceremonies. Instead, they gathered beside the open-chested statue. No speeches, no banners, just presence, just breath. Some brought new offerings. Some sang, and some, like Mai, simply placed a hand on the wood and whispered his name. The day after the funeral, Mai found a small note tucked inside one of his carving drawers. 4 words in his shaky script. Don't look, just listen. The blackened block was never found. Some say he buried it beneath the tamarind tree. Others believe he placed it inside the statue when no one was watching. And a few say it wasn't meant to be found at all. If you believe that the most powerful legacies are not displayed behind glass, but carried in breath and touch and song, then you understand what Vin left behind. He didn't leave a masterpiece. He left a mystery, and in doing so, ensured that we would keep listening. Long after the carving stopped. Years passed. The statue remained. It darkened with time soaked in sun rain and the breath of countless villagers who came not to see but to speak. Vin's workshop was never turned into a museum. Mai kept it open not as a business, but as a space for anyone who needed silence with company. Children came to play beneath the tamarind tree. Lovers carved their initials into fence posts. Tourists, when they found it, always left confused there was nothing to buy, and yet they lingered, as if something unseen had asked them to stay. One of those children was Lynn. She was born 2 years after Vin passed, the daughter of a seamstress and a fisherman, a quiet girl who liked shadows and rhythms. From a young age, she would sit beside the old statue for hours, tracing her fingers along its open chest, humming songs no one had taught her. At first, her parents thought nothing of it. Children imagine things after all. But by age 6, Lynn began carving. No one had shown her how. Not Mai, not the other elders. But one morning, she walked into the workshop, picked up a scrap of jackfruit wood, and began slicing away with a dull fruit knife. What emerged wasn't polished. It was raw, uneven, but hauntingly familiar. A bend in the grain shaped like a spine, a hollow curve where breath should go. By 10, she had carved 5 figures, none with faces, all with open chests. When Mai asked her why, she shrugged. I don't know. I just hear something. I follow it. Mai didn't question her after that. Instead, she brought out an old box of Vin's tools, oiled, wrapped in linen, still carrying the scent of camphor and sweat. Lin touched them with reverence, like she was greeting something she'd met before but couldn't name. She didn't rush. She never asked for approval. She only carved when the air around her felt still enough. People began to notice, not just the shapes, but the feeling her carvings left behind. They weren't decorative. They were listening. Visitors described the same sensation they had once felt beside Vin's statue, that they were being gently heard, even if they said nothing. Mai began to wonder if Vin's final carving, the one that vanished, hadn't been buried after all. Maybe it hadn't been carved in wood. Maybe it had been planted. In the hush of his final nights, in the echo of his last lullaby, maybe he had carved the shape of memory into something softer than timber, into the rhythm of a child yet to arrive. If you believe that what we leave behind isn't always stone or story, but the impulse to begin again, then you already know Lin isn't a prodigy. She's an answer. Lin was 12 when she completed her first full sculpture. Not a study, not a fragment, a complete piece. It stood no taller than her knee, small, round, modest. It had no arms, no legs, no eyes. Just a shape with a wide-open center, carved so carefully it looked like a doorway that had been worn smooth by many hands. When Mai saw it, she didn't ask what it was. She simply knelt beside it and whispered, "It's ready." They placed it beneath the tamarind tree in the very spot where Vin had once carved alone at night, where he'd held his final block of wood close like a secret. No one was told to come. But that evening, just before dusk, people began arriving. Not in groups, not with ceremony, one by one. The boy who used to whisper names into the old statue was now nearly grown. He came with empty hands. The school teacher came. The widow. A farmer who had never spoken at these gatherings brought his grandson. They sat in the grass. Some cried, some said nothing, some just breathed. And for the first time in the village's quiet tradition, no one brought objects to place inside. Instead, they spoke, one by one, their own truths. A man admitted to abandoning his brother during the war. A young woman confessed she had wanted to run away every day for years, but stayed because of her mother's smile. An old carpenter whispered that he had stolen food as a boy and never forgave himself. No one judged, no one left. It was not a confession box, it was a listening bowl. And Lin, seated a little ways away, did not say a word. She simply placed her hand on the carving and waited. That night, the wind shifted. The rain that had always fallen in rhythms of memory now moved with a different sound, something lighter, less burdened. And when morning came, a single line had been etched beneath the sculpture's hollow center. No one claimed to have carved it. The line was crooked, faint, barely visible. But it read, not for keeping, for releasing. Lin's carving was never named. It didn't need to be. It wasn't a monument or a shrine or even an heirloom. It was the first work in the village that didn't belong to anyone or everyone, but to the act of truth-telling itself. If this story has stayed with you until now, maybe it's because you too carry something unspoken. And if so, don't be afraid. Somewhere in some quiet room, there is always a carving with space left open. For your name, for your voice, for the song that hasn't been sung yet. And if these stories move you the way wood moved beneath the old hands, you can join us here at Wood Carving Artist, where each carving holds not just shape, but soul.